Dr. Huemer, thank you for being on my podcast. You're very welcome here, and it's a great pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So, Dr. Huemer, you are a moral realist and an intuitionist. This is a meta-ethical stance. Would you mind explaining this position to our audience with your own words briefly?
So moral realists are people who believe that there are objective values or something like that. There are objective evaluative truths. And what does that mean, objective? It means that their truth is not dependent on the attitudes of observers towards the things being evaluated. So there are things that are right or wrong, regardless of how we feel about them. They would be wrong even if we somehow thought that they were right, or even if we wanted to do them or whatever. Ethical intuitionism is a form of moral realism. Basically, there's two main forms. They're the ethical naturalists who think that you can reduce evaluative facts to descriptive facts. So you could explain what good means in some way without using evaluative terms. Or you could explain the sort of the nature of goodness without using evaluative terms. The intuitionists deny this. So the intuitionists think, no, value is irreducible. There's evaluative things and descriptive things, and you can't explain value using descriptive language. The other difference is the naturalists usually try to explain ethical knowledge empirically somehow. That in some way you can justify evaluative statements by appealing to observations. And the intuitionists think you cannot do this, and so you have to rely on something called ethical intuition. And what's an ethical intuition? And well, in philosophy, intuitions are basically mental states in which, when you think about something, it seems self-evident or something like that. So when you think about, 2 is less than 3, you'll have an immediate sense that that's obviously correct, which we call an intuition. Okay, and sometimes you have ethical intuitions, like you shouldn't cause harm to people just for the fun of it. So when you think about that, that's just going to seem obviously correct, and so that's an ethical intuition.
Great. Are moral truths self-evident or just non-inferential?
Oh, I don't know. What do you have in mind by that distinction there?
Because when you say self-evident, I think, at least in the common sense, we might think of something that is obvious to everyone. I know you make a distinction between obviousness and self-evident in your book, but non-inferential would be like it's not reducible, it's not
Yeah.
dependent on knowledge. But what I mean is that they appear like ready, like available, like some idea available, or are they just something that are not predicated on uh, reasoning, right?
There are different ways that you could use self-evidence, right? So we should distinguish these different characteristics that a belief could have. So one characteristic is non-inferential. That is, sometimes when people say self-evident, this is the main thing they're talking about, that the belief is not based upon another belief. So you don't have to give a justification, like an argument or reasoning for it. You could just directly apprehend it.
Yeah.
Right. But another thing that people might be interested in is whether the belief is absolutely certain. And notice that that is a completely different idea. It's like, whether something's non-inferential is completely different from whether it's absolutely certain. But people frequently confuse those together.
What are all the objective moral properties you believe exist? For instance, is wrongness a property or just a privation of rightness?
Um, hmm. Yeah, is that a real difference? Um, yeah, usually I say there's a property of rightness and a property of wrongness. It might be the other way. It might be that rightness is the absence of wrongness, right? So
Right.
there's being permissible and there's being impermissible, but like an action is permissible by default if there's no reason why it shouldn't be, right? So it might be that permissibility is actually the absence of wrongness. I think that, yeah, that sounds more plausible.
Yeah,
Um,
because we are talking about G. Moore. He used
yeah.
to focus on goodness, right, and rightness, and I'm not completely sure, but some people say these are the only two that exist. So you don't get to identify which are the properties that are real
Oh,
and intuitive.
yeah. So so I think J.E. Moore was mistaken in thinking that you only need good and bad, and that I think you need right and wrong as distinct properties. This comes out in W.D. Ross, the slightly later intuitionist. Um, now, so and why? Like Moore's way of trying to reduce everything to goodness was to interpret rightness as like an action is right if it produces the most good or something like that. And so it looks like you need some other moral concept besides just good and bad, right? You know, to capture like when I am and am not required to do the thing that's better. The other thing was, well, sometimes it looks like it's actually impermissible to do the thing that produces more good, right? So like, you have a healthy patient and then you have 5 patients who need organ transplants, and like you could kill the healthy patient and then distribute 5 of his organs to 5 other people and save their lives. And that would produce more good, or, because 5 lives is better than 1 life. So, but it looks like it's also wrong. So,
Yeah, but you don't get to specify and identify all the properties that exist. You
yeah.
just claim that they exist.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, there was a big issue about whether you need rightness in addition to goodness, um, or whether permissibility even exists. Okay, but yeah, how many moral properties are there? I don't know, because like you could count all of the virtues. Like if you count thin evaluative or thick evaluative properties, like all of the terms for virtues refer to thick evaluative properties. So, like property of being courageous or property of being honest or just, and that. So these are all evaluative properties. So there's a lot of them, yeah, right? If you count like that. Um, what philosophers call the thick evaluative properties are ones that have an evaluative meaning in addition to some descriptive conditions. So courageous is not just good, but it's good in a specific way.
Mhm.
And so there are descriptive conditions for applying courageous. You can't say somebody's courageous because they gave money to charity or something. Not just anything that's good counts. So, okay. So if you count the thick evaluative properties, there's a whole bunch of them. If you count only the thin evaluative properties, then there might only be 2, right? There's like permissible versus impermissible, which is sort of one property, one dimension. Then there's good versus bad.
Yeah, that's interesting because, for instance, in the history of philosophy and in Catholic and Christian philosophy, you have the idea that only good is real and bad is
Yes.
privation. Like, is go back to Augustine. I assume you are a critic of this view.
Yeah. Well, that just seems obviously false, right? It's just obvious. So, you know, there's pleasure and there's pain. Is pain just the absence of pleasure? No, no, it is not. So, imagine like you go to the medieval torture chamber, they're stretching you on the rack and they're saying, this is just the absence of pleasure. No, it's not.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not just the absence of goodness. Of course, the motivation for this, I guess, motivation for this was um, responding to a somewhat weird version of the problem of evil, where the problem is to acquit God of being the author of evil. So to say that God didn't cause and is not responsible for all the bad things in the world, and you could say that by saying the bad things aren't really things. So, so it's not that God caused evil, it's just that he failed to cause maximal good. Okay, but I don't even think that that solves any interesting problem, because then there's just the problem of why God didn't make more good, even if that was true, right? Like a maximally good, perfect being they wouldn't leave any absences of good. They would make as much good as they could.
Right. Um, is there a lot of disagreement between you and other contemporary intuitionists?
Probably not, I don't think. I have to think what the disagreements would be. I think Robert Oddie has a different description of intuition. Like, right, where I think his view is that, well, you know something intuitively if your justification for it comes simply from understanding concepts.
Yeah, yeah.
And and it's not that I'm really against that, but my description is, well, no, there's a particular type of mental state called an intuition in which something seems to you to be the case. So an intuitive belief is one that's based on an intuition. That's not a huge difference, I don't think. Um, I think there's some disagreement among intuitionists about how particularistic to be, sort of like whether you should try to articulate some very general ethical theory or whether you should try to just judge each individual case on its own. And I guess I just sort of have a moderate view on that, right? So, so I think just in general, just, in all subject matters, it's usually more reliable to start by judging particular cases. We get particular examples and we know about them, and then we try to generalize. But I'm not like the most particularistic people, because I don't like the most particularistic people, like I guess Jonathan Dancy, think that, that's all you do. You just judge the particular cases. And every time you make a generalization, it's wrong.
Mhm.
And, I'm not sure that that's the case. So, you look at a bunch of cases and then you try to draw generalizations from them.
Okay. Um, I assume you are agnostic about God, even though in your book you refute divine command theory. Nowadays, Thomist philosophers often argue that morality is part of God and that laws cannot exist without a legislator and or causes. How would you respond to this?
Oh, this seems false. Seems obviously false. So yeah, there may or may not be a creator. Or so I should say, like, I'm agnostic about the existence of a creator, which could be called God, but I think that there couldn't be an all-powerful being. There couldn't be a maximally perfect being. And this has to do with my views about the infinite. But okay, but there could be a very powerful creator. Okay, but even if there was, that being wouldn't have anything to do with morality. So suppose that there was a super powerful being who created you, and then they told you to do something. So what? Why why would you have to do it? I don't get it. Because they're powerful and because they can torture you if you don't do it. Okay, well, that's not a moral reason, that's a prudential reason. Right. And then, well, so the divine command theorist would say, yeah, it's just like sort of the meaning, or it's just the nature of what obligation is. That just doesn't seem to be true, right? So, um, like standard objections to the divine command theory are things like, oh, so if God told you to just like throw babies into a fire for fun and laugh at them while they're burning, that would be morally good and right and whatever. God can make it praiseworthy. That doesn't seem true. And then, the other traditional objection is, so is God good or not? And if you say, no, God isn't good, then it's totally mysterious why we would have to obey him. If you say God is good, then you say, okay, and what does that mean? Because you told me that moral concepts derive from the will of God. So God is good just means God approves of himself or something like that.
Yeah,
Well, I can approve of myself. Like, so it's like just because there's a powerful being that approves of themselves, that doesn't make them good. And that doesn't seem like that's what good means.
yeah.
Okay.
They try to account for that, distanciating from the command theory guys, because they say we're not command theory. We are we are kind of Aristotelian guys, you know, like there's this first cause, and it's like it's something you cannot escape from. So you're just a derivation of that. So they
Yeah.
account morality as being a necessary part of this, you know, of this first cause, because they would disagree with you that about the source. Right? For them, there's a clear, you know, uh, first principle, first beginning, and they seem somehow addicted to Aristotle. Really, like if like
Yeah.
Aristotle figured it out and Aquinas perfected it, and the answers we need are all
Yeah.
yes. And contemporary analytic philosophies, they don't read Aristotle, and they are just silly.
Yeah.
You know, I
Well,
I get this.
yeah. So
I would.
just, but before like addressing the philosophical arguments, let me just suggest that this is an improbable point of view, right? It's unlikely that a philosopher who lived 2,000 years ago who was wrong about everything else, right? He wrote about a lot of stuff, including a lot of science, and all of his scientific theories we know are 100% wrong. It's very, and he lived 2,000 years ago, and it's not his fault. He's not a dumb person, but he lived 2,000 years ago and he didn't know what we know today. It's very improbable that that person has, basically the philosophical truth. And in all other areas of study, there's been enormous progress over the last 2,000 years. And if you don't pay attention to what's been learned in the last 2,000 years, you're totally lost. That's true in all other areas. It would be very bizarre if that wasn't true in philosophy, right? And like if you went into a physics class and they started with, okay, let's learn Aristotle's physics, you would say they were guilty of malpractice, right? You should not you should not be learning that. Anyway, um, okay. Okay. So there's a first cause, which is the cause of everything. Well, so I think there could be a cause of all of the contingent things, but but it doesn't have to be God. It could be an intelligent being, but it doesn't have to be. Like maybe the Big Bang was the cause of everything else. Okay, and I don't think that this is a correct or good theory. Okay, but whatever. It's not inconsistent. And I don't know why that's worse than saying that God was the cause of everything else. Okay, but in particular, there couldn't be a cause of literally everything, because there couldn't be a cause of the necessary truths. So, and in particular, there couldn't be a cause of morality, because morality is necessary truths. So or like the fundamental moral truths are necessary. So, like the fact that pain is pro tanto bad, it's um that suffering is a harm. Okay. And harms are bad, other things being equal. Those are necessary truths. So there can't be a cause of that, right? Because I think in general there can't be a cause of necessary truth. And it didn't have a beginning in time, so it can't have a cause. And so and like even if God created us, like he created the people, that could be because we're contingent. That still wouldn't make, like, that wouldn't have anything to do with morality. That wouldn't mean that now we have to obey him or anything like that.
Yeah, right. They just seem to unify morality and this, you know, all-powerful being into one thing, not like, you know, morality coming from the beings, like, oh, it's a part of God. It's like a necessary thing as part of the necessary creator. But yeah, I don't know. It seems flawed. But many people here are totally convinced, especially people
Mm.
who are not versed in philosophy. Here in Brazil, at least, people will hear about an apologetic talking about Aquinas, and go
Yes.
they go out of the lecture totally convinced about the arguments.
Yeah. And so, yeah, by the way, like, so I think, like the people who are steeped in the Catholic and Thomas tradition might not realize how parochial this is, that like, most philosophers have moved beyond that like a long time ago. It's probably not because we're all stupid, because right, because like as I was saying, like, well, most fields advance, and like, and okay, and like, I'm not saying that we're smarter than Aristotle or that we're smarter than Aquinas, because those are really smart guys, but they were living hundreds centuries or thousands of years ago. So, okay, and just harping on Aristotle again, um, his philosophy is shot through with teleology. Teleology is not a small part of his philosophy. It's everywhere, like constantly talking about natural functions. And that is completely obsolete. Like there's no modern science in which you talk about teleology. Teleology plays zero role in modern scientific explanations. So like there's no scientific evidence for there being such a thing, with a possible exception of human beings having purposes. Okay, like we have goals. Nature doesn't have goals as far as we can tell. Like that doesn't add anything to our scientific understanding of the world. So, okay, and so if you take that out, I think you just take out the whole philosophy.
Yeah. Okay, great. Um, okay, I'm gonna move on to your argument for souls and reincarnation. I read one of the articles where you present this argument. Correct me if I misunderstood, but it seems like a probability argument and an argument about recurrence. It relies on the
Yeah.
past and the future being infinite, or just the future. This is a question, and it's different from what people usually means by when they say reincarnation. They usually think about some ghost floating around that gets into the body and the body reincarnates. Isn't it more precisely a repetition or recurrence theory rather than a reincarnation theory?
Um, well, okay, so there were I feel
Several.
like there were several questions
Sorry,
there that
sorry.
I'm not I'm going to forget. Um, so yeah, so you asked, oh, does it require infinite past and future or just an infinite future? So the answer is like the argument really requires both the past and the future to be infinite. So there's no beginning of time and there's no end of time. It's widely agreed that there's no end of time. It's a little controversial that the past is infinite because like there are cosmologists today who think maybe the past began 14 billion years ago. Time began 14 billion years ago. Um, anyway, so like we could talk about why I don't think that, but okay, why the argument requires that. So like here's one way of thinking about it. Um, so I suppose there are some conditions for you to be incarnated or for you to be born. Whatever those conditions are, they have some objective chance of occurring. They have some probability of occurring per unit time. I mean physical probability. Um, okay, that probability is either zero or non-zero. Right. And if you like, you could take it over long periods of time, like, if the universe, so if time is infinite in both directions, then you can take extremely long periods and there are infinitely many of them. So you could take like a whole cycle of the universe. There's some probability of your being born per unit time. It's either zero or it's non-zero. If it's zero, then you shouldn't be here because, if you have a zero probability and then you take, just multiply it over all of time, you still get zero. Okay. If it's non-zero, then that means that it should have happened before now. And so, because there's infinite past time. And that's where the infinite past time is required for the argument. Because if you only have a finite past, then you can't predict that it should have happened before now. Okay, but then if you assume that people can only live once, and thus you assume there's no reincarnation, then that means that you shouldn't be here now. Because it should have happened before now, which would have prevented you from being here now, so you wouldn't be here now. Okay.
It's mind-boggling. It's very interesting, but uh, sometime it would have to be the first time, right?
Well, with the past being infinite, there's no first time, right? There's just
Yeah,
infinitely many going back forever.
yeah, I get it. But and what do you say about the fact that it sounds, at least to me, more like a repetition and a recurrence than reincarnation?
Well, I mean, that is a form of reincarnation, right? So, when you get reincarnated, that just means that you live again, right? No,
Yeah, but I mean, this is very similar to one of Nietzsche's ideas, the eternal
yes.
recurrence. But I'm sure Nietzsche wouldn't use the term reincarnation, because when we talk about reincarnation, at least in the spiritism kind of way, we think of ghosts floating, around
Yes.
until their time to reincarnate again. And
Yes.
your theory sounds a little bit more like a recurrence, like objects can recur, like this glass can
Yeah.
come back in
Yeah.
a
Well, yeah.
it's after now, but why do you insist this is a incarnation?
Yeah. So I mean, in the paper I discussed the Poincaré recurrence theorem. So if you have a physical system, under certain assumptions, it has to repeat something close to its initial state. This requires an assumption of unlimited time, and also requires an assumption of there's a limited region of the state space that it's confined to. So this requires, like in the case of the universe, it requires the assumption that the universe is bounded. So if the universe expands out forever, then it never repeats its initial state. Okay, but if it doesn't expand out forever, then there's sort of like there's a limit to how many configurations it can be in, so to speak. So it has to sort of repeat. Now, if there were only finitely many configurations, then it would have to literally repeat the same configuration over again. And then if you assume determinism, then you would think that everything that happens after that is exactly the same. So this might be what Nietzsche thought when he was introducing the eternal recurrence, right? Like he might have mistakenly thought there's only finitely many states and determinism is true. So the exact history of the universe will repeat over and over again. But that's not true, because actually there's infinitely many states. So even if you're in a finite region, so like between my hands, that's a finite distance, but there are infinitely many points in that distance, right? Okay. So even if you just had to move in this space, you wouldn't ever have to repeat an exact point. You wouldn't have to cross over the same point, but you would have to come close. Right. So if you just think about this in
Right,
space,
right,
in the spatial region, if you start out here and you move around, if you move around forever, you have to eventually come back close.
right.
But you don't have to cross the exact point. Okay. And that's a good analogy, because the space of possible states the universe could be in is like a space. It's just a many-dimensional space. Okay. All right. So, my view is different from Nietzsche's, because I don't think you get an exact repetition. You can just get
Oh,
an approximate repetition. And the next time something happens that's really close to what happened when you were born, like there was the state the world was in when you were born. So maybe that will create another version of you. It'll be you again. Okay.
yeah,
But what happens after that is not guaranteed to be the same, because there could be other things that are different in the world around. And, even in you, there will be slight differences.
yeah,
And the universe, the world is chaotic, so the differences can multiply. So you don't get exact repetitions. Yeah.
yeah. But for you, the in between this extremely enormous time period, the souls they experience something or not?
Um, as far as I know, you can only experience something while you're in a body. So, and, there's very good empirical reason to think this, right? The empirical reason is that the different kinds of experiences that we can have in this life are tied to events in our brains. And if you get damage to a part of your brain, then you lose mental capacities.
Yeah,
So that, like if you lose your eyes, or just you lose the parts of your brain that receive signals from the eyes. So if your visual cortex is damaged, then you can't have visual experiences anymore. And then, there's particular parts of the brain that are tied to memories. And like if you get damage to the brain, you could lose your memories. You could lose different cognitive capacities. So a reasonable extension of this is that if you lose your entire brain, then you lose all of your experiences. However, like in my view, you still exist. You just exist in this very boring state of having no experiences.
yeah. Talk about boring. You are a disembodied soul without
Yeah.
any possibilities.
Yeah, actually, it's not even boring, because boredom is an experience.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Uh, So yeah, this is what I meant. That when you come across your articles, you think you're going to read something that's like oh, Spiritism proved or something like by the Intuitionist philosopher. And when you read and you see what it's really like, well, I don't know. This is not what I was expecting. There are no ghosts
Yeah,
floating around, but it seems, of course, a lot more
yeah,
plausible than that would seem.
yeah,
But
yeah. When you tell people, "Hey, I've got a proof of reincarnation," they'd be expecting memories of past lives or
yeah,
something.
yeah.
And and there are cases of people who claim to have memories of past lives, but as best I can tell, those are all false. I mean that they're not really past life memories. They might be induced sort of hallucinatory memories.
Yeah, sure. Here we have a very big movement of Spiritism, which is kind of odd because it's this kind of religion that started in France in the late 19th century with Allan Kardec.
Mm.
And it seems like the most popular place and the only significant place where people practice this religion is here in Brazil today, where
Wow.
there is this belief that they can talk to the dead, that spirits are really ghosts floating around, and there is a reincarnatory plan designed by angelic creatures for the
Yeah.
evolution of the souls, and that God would be the most evolved soul, and every incarnation is a chance for you to evolve. So if
Yeah.
you are born with any disability, it's your fault because in the other incarnation you were a thief or something.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. 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 Well, this is similar to Buddhism, right? And
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's the karma. Um, okay, yeah, and also like in Buddhism, you're trying to reach enlightenment. So over your lifetime, you try to move upward. And basically, I think this can't be true. Basically, like the doctrines of most religions, maybe this is all religions, I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's not true. But anyway, okay. Um, most religions, they have an idea that there's progress towards a certain end state. And I think that cannot be true. Like even at that very abstract level, it can't be that the universe is progressing towards some end
right.
because time is infinite in both directions. And so if there's infinite time and there was a goal, we would have reached that goal and we would have reached it an infinite time ago because we've already had an infinite amount of time. Right? So like however long it takes to get there, we would get there, unless it takes infinite time, in which case we'll never get there. Um,
Right,
right. But so like with infinite time in both directions, it has to be cyclical.
right.
And the reason why I corrected myself is, oh, I think the Hindu view is cyclical, and it just keeps going forever.
Yeah, there are lots of religions, but most of the most popular ones, seems to rely a lot on teleology and progress. And talking about that, would you mind telling why you don't think the universe had a beginning? Not universe precisely, not physical universe, but reality uh, had a beginning in general.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah. So sometimes you hear people say maybe God created time, like back. Maybe that's what happened at the time of the Big Bangs that he created time. And I would like to say no, he didn't. And this is an incoherent idea. Right. And why? Because so what is it to create something? When you create something, you perform an action that causes that thing to start existing. So first it doesn't exist, you perform an action, and then it does exist, and your action caused that. Okay, and all of that makes no sense unless there's already time. So like, God created time means first there was no time. So there was a time when there was no time. And God performed an action, even though he's outside of time. And that action caused something, even though there's no time. And all of that's incoherent, right? In order to have causation, you have to have time. In order to have an action, you have to have time. Right. And okay. So if you agree with that God couldn't have created time, then you realize, well, nothing could have created time. Because the same point would apply. Even if it's not an intelligent being, there couldn't be an event if there wasn't any time, and there couldn't be any causation if there wasn't any time, so there couldn't be creation. So nothing could create time. Okay. And so then, yeah, and then the next thing you think is, oh, okay, well, maybe nothing created time, but somehow it just started
Yeah.
with no explanation. But there can't even really be an event of time starting or coming into existence or something, because what that means is first there wasn't time and then there was time. Like, right. So like,
Yeah.
if when the earth comes into being, what that means is first there was no earth and then a little later there was an earth. So, okay, so it can't be that first there was no time and then later there was time,
Yeah.
because there can't be a time without time.
Yeah. At what
Right. So,
time started?
yeah. So, okay. So, yeah. So there, if it couldn't have started, it has to go back forever.
Right. Yeah, and so are, for example, the moral truths. They are just, ontologically real, as well as the eternity of time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, yes. So, moral properties exist necessarily. Um, abstract objects exist necessarily. So like the numbers exist necessarily.
Yeah.
And they're not in time. Like, 2 plus 2 equals 4. But if you ask, okay, when does 2 plus 2 equal 4? There's no there's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
answer to that. It doesn't do that at a time.
Yeah. Even if there were no sentient and intelligent beings to have ethical intuitions, if there was just uh, animals that are less intelligent, they would still be the same true, the same basic moral truths would still apply in your view.
Um, yeah, depending on what moral truths you're talking about. So, yeah, okay, yeah, so there are no humans, but there are sentient creatures.
Yeah.
So, it would still be true that pain is bad and, enjoyment is good.
And how do you deal with predation in nature?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, the reason why I said, oh, it depends on what moral truths you're talking about is, so like the animals might not have any obligations. And why is that? Because to have an obligation, you have to be capable of governing your behavior according to moral values. Right? You don't have to actually govern your behavior in that way, but you have to be capable of it.
Yeah.
And probably the non-intelligent animals are not even capable of doing that, so they can't have obligation.
Right.
You can't be obligated to do something that you can't do. So the predators don't have obligations. I mean, none of the animals have obligations. Okay, so the predators are not violating their obligations, but there are still facts about what's good or bad. So there's a fact that the suffering of the animals is bad, and there's an enormous amount of suffering in nature, and it's true that that's bad, even though we can't do anything about it.
Yes, and this leads me to the one of the questions I was most looking forward to ask you. I don't know if you heard of the philosopher David Benatar. He wrote the
Yeah,
book.
yeah, of course.
Uh, yeah, he wrote the book There Not to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, where he argues that because of that, there's a lot of suffering, and sentient beings, regardless of if they are humans or not, they experience more suffering than pleasure. There is a basic asymmetry argument that he does. And he concludes arguing that existence is bad. It's wrong to bring
Yeah,
babies into the world. He's an anti-natalist. So
yeah.
how would you respond to his view?
Well, so the first thing you suggested is, oh, maybe there's more pain than pleasure in life, and that might be true, but it's not obvious. There's an enormous amount of suffering in the natural world. It's not clear whether it outweighs the total value of life. Um, but actually, David Benatar's view is that that doesn't matter, that it's still wrong to create someone, even if their life is going to be mostly pleasure. This is odd, but like the pleasure that the pleasure that your offspring would have if you were to create them doesn't count as a reason for creating them. But the pain that they would have does count as a reason against creating them. So you always have most reason not to create them. Right. But I think this is not true. I think the pleasure they would have is a reason for creating them.
Okay.
Okay. And so and I don't totally get what his argument is for why the pleasure doesn't count as a reason in favor of creating. I think part of it might have been sort of an attempt to avoid the implication that you would have an obligation to have children if like it's low cost to you. And right, and the children would have happy lives, right? Because if their happiness is a reason for creating them, then you might be obligated, right? And then a bunch of people don't like that idea.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's probably just true. You know, probably you are just obligated. If you could have children at low cost and they would have very high utility, then it's probably wrong not to have them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah. By the way, I want to add though that there's a presupposition of this whole of Benatar's arguments, like whatever other weird stuff is going on that most philosophers disagree with. A presupposition which most philosophers agree with is that if you were going to have a child, that child will only exist if you decide to procreate. So there's
Yeah.
like if you have the child, there will be a person, and that person would never have existed if you hadn't had them. But of course, in my view, that's not true because everyone who's ever born has lived infinitely many times in the past and will live infinitely many times in the future. And you're just like deciding whether to cause them to be embodied at this time. And yeah, so they will either be disembodied and have no experiences, or they'll be embodied and have some experiences. And obviously, they're better off in the latter case, provided the experiences are mostly positive. It's better to have positive experiences than to have no experiences.
Yeah, I think he would argue that this is never the case for nobody, for anyone. It's always going to be more pain than pleasure.
I mean, this is obviously not true. I don't think that's his view
Oh,
that everyone is suffering more. It's
yeah,
plausible that the animals in nature are suffering more. It's hard to tell, right? Because really we can't interview them. They don't say very much. But it's definitely not true for people. Right? Okay, there are a lot of people whose lives are suffering, but there are a lot of people whose lives are mostly good. So, like you could ask some people, okay,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. But I mean, I don't know if he thinks that a billionaire who is struggling to have his next company the way he wants, exactly the way he wants, is a suffering that's already an indicator of life being bad. I don't know if someone could raise this point, like, even for this guy, existence is bad, is suffering, he has back pain,
yeah, yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Well, I mean, indeed, everyone has some suffering in their life, right? So, even the seemingly most successful people, whatever, they will have frustrations from day to day. And as you mentioned, like, when you get the back pain, like, there's no amount of money that stops you from having medical problems.
yeah.
And so, yeah, you could get the best medical care, but you could still like whatever, you could still get cancer or something. Um, so okay, but so like Benatar's argument only works if you have this view that the pleasure doesn't count. You can't use the pleasure to outweigh the pain. It's totally implausible that the pain always outweighs the pleasure if you weigh them up like in the quantities. Okay, but like his view, I guess, is that no, only the pain counts, right?
Yeah.
Before you have the child, the pain counts as a reason for not, and you don't get to count the pleasure that they would have. But after a person already exists, then you can weigh the two against each other.
Okay. Uh, well, how do you respond to the evolutionary critiques of intuitionism, who say that morality is tied to survival instincts and group needs?
Hmm. Yeah, this doesn't appear to be true. I mean, so the people who try to explain our moral values in terms of evolution have a hard time explaining the moral progress that has occurred over human history. There's been an enormous amount of change and apparently we would say progress. And like it's not just random change, it's that society's values have evolved in a particular direction, which you could describe as liberalism,
Right.
like a liberalization of values, which is sort of less willingness to commit violence and coercion, more respect for the dignity of the individual, and sort of value for equality. Okay, so um, it's hard for evolutionary psychologists to explain this. Because so you could explain the values that people had, like in primitive times, the values in primitive societies. You could explain that by appeal to evolution. And that actually looks pretty plausible for like a lot of cases. For a lot of the weird things about the values of primitive societies, you could explain it evolutionarily. But then you can't explain the modern liberal values. And since we today are the ones with the modern liberal values, we're not the ones whose values are being debunked,
Right.
right? So so we don't have to worry about that, but the primitive people should worry about the debunking, right? So like an example is in primitive societies, it was common to go to war with neighboring tribes and just like kill the men and the children and kidnap the women, and then and then the women become coerced wives for the people in your tribe.
Yeah.
And today we would regard that as horrible behavior. Okay, so well, you could explain why people were doing that in the past and why they thought it was okay. I guess they thought it was okay, or they might have even thought that it was glorious, great, or something. You could explain that in evolutionary terms because that behavior would increase their reproductive fitness. All right, okay, and also, by the way, like because the other tribes were likely to do that, that's like extra reason for you to do that. Um, okay, everyone else is doing it, so you got to do it too. But then you can't explain why today we think that that's horrible.
Yeah, that sounds about right. um, it's hard for the evolutionary to account for that, but I'm sure there are a lot of objections, as they are there always are when it comes to philosophy. But um, so this also helps you to deal with disagreement, right? Because in your book you say that the disagreement between people and cultures that most uh, many times are not really about disagreements about moral facts, but rather about uh, other kinds of facts that are tied to moral facts, right? This is how you account for disagreement. If not, please correct me.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are many causes of disagreement, right? So, people want you to explain why people disagree about values. And this is supposed to be like a particular problem for moral realists.
Yeah.
But you should notice that people disagree about um, quite a lot of things, right? There's a lot of disagreement. It's not just about values. And in no other area do people say, oh, because there's disagreement, that means there are no facts, right?
Mhm.
So, like we observe so the cultural relativists observe that, oh, there are different moral beliefs in different cultures. And especially primitive societies, they will have widely varying practices, widely differing from ours, right? So in primitive societies, there will be like a lot of polygamy, and then they'll have like like very harsh rules. So whatever in some societies, homosexuality is like a capital crime or something. Okay, so you're like, okay, wow, they have really different values. But the other thing that you should notice is, well, they also had very different descriptive beliefs about the world. So, like, if you looked at their descriptions of like where they thought the earth came from, where they thought people came from, like what they think causes diseases, and that like they think that diseases can be caused by somebody cursing you. Well, that's just a descriptive belief. So, okay, so they differ from us in all these other respects, and they're completely wrong, by the way. Right? In the ways in which their descriptive beliefs differ from ours, they're completely wrong. Okay, and I realize that this is upsetting to cultural relativists that I would say that somebody was wrong, but then anyway, but that's what the evidence indicates. So it's really not surprising if they're also wrong about values, right? Like that is kind of what you should expect.
Yeah,
Right?
the thing, with Aristotle we were talking about. Uh, yeah, and it seems that many people today regard intuitionism as an odd, a queer theory, like John Mackey,
Yeah,
who you respond to in ethical intuitionism, and that seems a lot to do with the this sort of addiction to physicality, to empiricism.
yeah,
Do you think that's right? That in the late the 20th century we've had this overwhelming fixation on physical realms.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like, a lot of philosophers today are physicalists. This is philosophers in the sort of analytic, English speaking world tradition. Um, but there's something deeper than that, right? Like, well, why are most of the philosophers physicalists? And basically, it's because they're sort of they're victims of scientism, right? So they're science worshipers or science enviers. Um, and so okay, so like modern science doesn't talk about values. Modern science doesn't study values, and there's no like experimental science investigating values. You can't do experiments on it, so it's unscientific. So therefore, we have to reject it. And like why they're physicalists? Like, oh well, like we can't see the soul, and we can't do experiments on it, and scientists don't talk about it, so that must not be real either. And I think this is not a good motivation, and in fact, this is not a scientific motivation. The scientific way of thinking does not involve talking about whether something is scientific and then rejecting something that seems to exist because you decided it was scientific. That is not scientific thinking.
Yeah.
That's ideological thinking, right? And so, okay, so like you mentioned John Mackey's quote argument from queerness. Like most philosophers, most of the anti-realist philosophers, they reject objective values because they think it sounds weird. And that's also why they reject the soul, right? Or mind-body dualism. And sometimes they reject free will because it's, quote, weird. And people will say this in conversation, but they will very rarely say it in print. But John Mackey is an exception where he did say it in print, but he used the word queer instead of weird because that was more commonly used then, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. But, I would like to point out like rejecting an idea because it, quote, sounds weird to you. This is a totally unscientific way of thinking, right? And really, and not only unscientific, but like really not rational. Like, what is the theory about how your vague sense of something sounding weird is a reliable guide to the nature of reality? And is weirdness an objective property? And it's like that you're detecting objective weirdness with your weirdness detector. Like, how is that more plausible or less weird than me detecting values with my ethical intuition?
Yeah. Yeah, everything can seem weird, existence can seem very weird. Physical
It
problems
is.
can seem weird. It is weird.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, right. And yeah, and by the way, a lot of the stuff in modern science is way weirder
Yeah,
than the stuff that philosophers have been saying. Like,
totally.
actually, moral realism isn't weird. Like if there's a view that has been held by almost everyone throughout human history, and you say you find it weird, then you're the weird one,
Yeah,
right? Like, right? It's like obviously the vast majority of people didn't find it weird, so there's something weird about your mind. But this, a lot of the stuff they say in modern science actually is objectively weird, where like almost everyone finds it strange, and even the scientists themselves think they find it strange.
yeah. And on the other hand, more realism, at least is historically, is kind of common sense.
Yeah.
There is a prejudice against common sense, and we cannot account for the total motives for that, but that's really seems to be a thing. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
anyway,
like in the intellectual world, you get credit for saying surprising things, just saying outrageous things and rejecting common sense, right?
right, yeah. Uh, well, another question that is one about aesthetics. If natural properties and moral properties are objective, can aesthetic properties be objective? Can, for instance, beauty be objective? When responding to Kant's third critique, idealist Friedrich Schiller argued that yes, beauty is objective. What is your view on that, on aesthetics?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. So there's one way in which I think aesthetic properties could not be objective, but I think this is probably not what people most care about. Okay, but the reason I say this is, well, aesthetics properties depend on the appearance of something. They're really properties of the appearance of an object.
Yeah.
Right. So, like when you look at an object, okay, like here's my book, Ethical Intuitionism. You're like, hey, is that a pretty book? that a pretty book cover or ugly? Well, uh, partly depends upon what the colors look like to you. And what the colors look like depends upon, our visual system. So there could be a species that looks at that and they have a different experience when they see it. And they're not misperceiving, they just perceive things differently from humans, right? Whatever, they have a different brain and different organs. And to the other species, it could be hideous, right? Although to me, it looks nice. Okay. And neither of us is wrong, right? Okay. And so, um, that shows that, well, the beauty or ugliness is properties of the appearance. It's not properties of the physical object in itself. And so, like, in that sense, it's subjective. Okay, but what you probably want to ask about, what I don't know, what most people are probably thinking about when they ask about objective beauty is like, okay, but given that it appears a certain way, is it a fact that that's beautiful?
Yeah, that's what
Okay.
the question.
And then I guess I would say, yeah, I guess that sounds objective to me.
Think-
Um, I'm not really sure, right? Because like, yeah, it's got something to do with your aesthetic reactions. So okay, so you have the appearance, but then you have like a quasi-emotional state, which is your aesthetic reaction that it's nice or something. And like there could be somebody who sees the colors the same way that you do, but they don't have that reaction.
Yeah.
Um, So like I suppose that most of the animals, like if they look at a painting, I suppose that well, if they have color vision like us, I guess some of them have the same kind of color vision that we have, like, three kinds of cones. Okay, so then they would look at the painting, and I suppose in some sense they would have the same experience. They would see the same distribution of colors, and in some sense the colors would look the same.
Okay.
But I suppose the animal wouldn't see it as beautiful.
Right. But
Okay, and so then now, maybe that's just like, oh, well, that's just a shortcoming. They have a cognitive shortcoming because they're not smart enough. Right. But also it could just be, no, it's just that we have an emotional sensibility. We just have an emotional reaction. Um, okay, but so then like, well, the beauty seems to have something to do with that, essentially. It has something to do with your sort of emotional reaction. Does that stop it from being objective? Well, I don't know. So like the beauty isn't exactly the reaction itself. It's sort of the properties of the object or the properties of the appearance of the object that would cause that reaction in you.
yeah,
So that could be like that could be sort of objective.
yeah, that's the thing. Is beauty reducible, or is it's like goodness for you?
Yeah. And the beauty is a very interesting property because it applies to so many things. Like, so, the ordinary example is like a physical object and, whatever, it has a distribution of colors and it's pretty. But people apply beauty to so many things, like equations could be said to be beautiful, like mathematicians would say, or physicists would say Gauss's law is beautiful, or something like that. Some of the equations of physics, and that's an abstract object. So there's a property that could be had by physical objects and abstract objects.
Yeah.
And then like um, you could describe some piece of behavior as beautiful, like it was a beautiful thing that they did. So, and like, I'm more inclined to think that it's objective when you have these sort of more abstract examples, right?
Ah, interesting.
Um, and like if somebody says, "Well, that was a beautiful thing that they did," that sounds to me more objective, possibly because it's partly moral. It's
Yeah,
partly a moral evaluation, which I already regard as objective.
yeah. So Plato had this connection between the good, the beautiful, right, and the true. So it's tied to classic metaphysics. But do you think this is real in your metaphysics? Could be real connection.
Um, I don't know. I think Plato had weird ideas about the ideas.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I just got done complaining about whatever the argument from weirdness. But anyway, it seems like Plato's ideas are weird in a way that moral realism isn't. It's like, like Plato's ideas are weird even to people throughout history. It was, it's probably weird even to the Greeks at the time. I think he was kind of confused about the abstract objects.
Okay.
So like in a way, I'm a Platonist in that I think abstract objects exist and they exist necessarily. So they don't depend upon the concrete objects, but nor do the concrete objects depend on them. But but I think he was confused because he was sort of thinking of the abstract objects as if they were like um, perfect exemplars of the property that they're representing,
Yeah.
right? Which is like they're perfect exemplars of themselves.
Oh, yeah.
So like, yeah, so like there's a form of man, and the form of man is like a perfect example of a man. That's a confused thought, right? There's no such thing. And that's like, and yeah, and like there wouldn't be a unique thing that
Right.
would be the perfect man. Okay, and then like beauty, the form of beauty is like the most beautiful thing. So it's like a perfect example of beauty. Well, what the hell is that? And what color is it? Like how big is it? Like no, there's no thing, right? There's no like perfect example of beauty.
Just as there's no perfect example of goodness.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Is there like a maximum goodness that you can have? Like, yeah, probably not, right? Because like for any amount of goodness you have, there could always be more.
Yeah. Uh, just to sum this up, your view, at least for now, is that aesthetic properties such as beauty can only be objective in abstract cases. Is that what you were saying or not?
And I don't really know if we should consider them objective.
Okay, okay.
So, and it's partly because I'm not totally clear on what it means in that case. So, like I had a blog post in which I compared. There's a music video called "Baby Shark Dance," and I compare that music video to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Okay, and the Baby Shark Dance, it's a very simple and repetitive music video that is intended for children. And it has like cartoon sharks. Okay. And that video I chose because it is the most watched video of all time. Right. Like it's been watched billions of times. And okay, so there's a question: is Baby Shark Dance better than the Moonlight Sonata? Because it is more popular and presumably, I suppose, has caused more pleasure in the world than Beethoven. Okay, and now I would like to suggest, even so, it is not. It's not better. Uh-huh. Okay, so is that objective? Well, I don't know. Like, if somebody says they think Baby Shark Dance is an objectively better piece of music than the Moonlight Sonata, I think they are wrong. Like, I don't, I would not say, oh yeah, it's just like they prefer vanilla over chocolate or whatever. I would say, no, that's not the case. It is not better.
It seems kind
Uh,
of objective that it's not the case. It's weird.
yeah, like so, like if objectivity just means like you could be right or wrong about it, then I think it's objective. Right. But if objectivity, I don't know, maybe it means something stronger. Like maybe it means that the nature of beauty is totally independent of our sensibilities. And then I don't think that.
Okay, great. And well, uh, I have two last questions. I know I just bombarded you with a lot of stuff. I'm sorry, but I was really looking
Yeah.
for this.
No, it's great.
And can you talk about your view on political authority a little bit in libertarianism? Just a
Yeah.
projection of your view.
Um, Basically, I think no state has authority. I have a book. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay. So there's also this book that everybody should buy on Amazon and stuff. The Problem of Political Authority. Um, no state has authority. What do I mean by that? So by authority, I mean the government appears to be claiming for itself a kind of special moral status that sets it above everyone else. So they claim an entitlement to do stuff to people that no one else is allowed to do, and that if anyone else were to do, you would consider it to be very wrong. So, like the government collects taxes, and if I were to decide to collect taxes, they would call me a thief and an extortionist. Like, and I just go to my neighbors and I just demand money from them and I threaten to lock them in cages if they don't give it to me. So they give me the money. And then and then I spend it on, helping the poor or whatever. Like I could give some of the money to the poor and people would still call me a thief and an extortionist. Okay. If I decide, like, there's a thing that might happen in America. Like, I decide that there's another country that's building weapons of mass destruction, and so I'm going to stop them. So now, I'm forcing my neighbors to give me money so that I can buy bombs, and then I go and blow up buildings and shoot people in that other country. People would call me a terrorist
Yeah.
and a murderer. Like,
Yeah.
okay, but that's a thing that would happen in the United States. Like the government would do that, and people wouldn't call them terrorists, or some people would still call them that. But anyway, um, okay, so why does the government get to do these things that would be wrong if anyone else were to do them? And the answer is, well, the government has authority, and I don't have any authority, so I can't do those things. Okay, great. So authority is like this moral status that's above everyone else that enables you to do things that other people aren't allowed to do. And also, it makes it so that other people are obligated to obey you. And why? Okay, why does the state have authority? And then my claim and my argument in the book is, there's just no good account of that. So I go through what people have said, but basically there is no good way of explaining why the state would have this special moral status. And so my claim is they don't actually. They're just a group of people who took power. They have power over the rest of us, and then they assert that they have authority. Right? And then they sort of like intimidate people into going along with them.
People might bring up the contractualist, Rousseau, Hobbes, and these guys who said that you have to do this, otherwise it's mayhem.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I mean, one popular suggestion that you get in the United States, I don't know how popular this is in other countries, but in the US, it's popular because I suppose people are told this in high school that there's a thing called the social contract where all of us have agreed to have a government. And in exchange, the government has agreed to protect us from criminals and foreign governments or something. And okay, that's a great theory. And so because we agreed to have a government, then we should obey them because we agreed to obey them. And also they get to force us to pay them because we agreed to pay them and to have them force us to pay. We agreed to all that. That's all great if that were true. The only problem with this is that it has no connection to empirical reality. There was no time at which we made this agreement. Like there's no contract. Like I can't just assert that I have a contract with you, and then like you ask me to show you the contract, and I don't have anything. I just say that you agree. Oh, you agreed implicitly. And,
This thing.
okay. And then they say, oh yeah, it was an implicit agreement. It wasn't explicit. So that's why I can't show you the paper. Okay. And when did I do this? Yeah, well, you didn't do it at any specific time, but you just implied that you agreed. Okay. And how did I imply that I agreed without saying it? And then they're like, well, because if you don't agree, you have to leave the country. And because every other habitable landmass is controlled by governments. If you don't agree to have a government, actually, you have to jump into the ocean and swim to Antarctica. That's what you have to do. You don't have a government. Just do that to indicate your lack of agreement. Otherwise, we'll assume that you agree to have a government. Okay. Okay, you're not trying to swim to Antarctica, so you must agree to have a government. This doesn't look persuasive to me. This wouldn't be a good way for me to secure agreement. Like if I say that you just agreed to pay me $1,000 because you didn't jump in the ocean and swim to Antarctica, that's not going to go over. I'm not going to be able to convince any court in the world that you owe me the money. So anyway, okay. The other thing you mentioned is, oh well, if we didn't have a government, there would be mayhem. So, possibly, yeah, maybe the government is preventing chaos and the breakdown of social order. But that doesn't really mean that they have authority. So like you could be doing something good, you could be providing a genuine service, but that doesn't give you like a special moral status where you get to order everybody around. And like so, yeah, what if I'm like I'm going around capturing criminals periodically and locking them up to stop them from hurting people. Okay, so then yeah, so I'm providing a valuable service. Maybe I'm stopping a breakdown of social order. Does that mean now that everyone is obligated to obey my commands? And now I could just tell people to do stuff that they otherwise don't have any reason to do apart from my command. There's no reason to do them, but they just have to do them because I said it. Like it doesn't seem right. Things that are maybe useless. Some of them are harmful. Okay, so like now because I'm stopping some criminals, now can I like send bombs over to Iraq and blow up buildings and shoot people? And that's going to be okay because I stopped some criminals. Like that doesn't seem true, right?
Okay, and people associate frequently libertarianism with egoism or egotism, which is kind of goes back to that author Ayn Rand. I think she popularized the idea, and it seems a little bit strange to connect egoism, Rand's egoism, with your moral realism, because
Yeah.
how does one ethical intuitionist account for being a libertarian?
Yeah. Well, so the connection between libertarianism and egoism is something that critics of libertarianism frequently say, and that's usually to attack libertarianism and followers of Ayn Rand. Like it's either people who are like, totally trying to discredit libertarianism or it's Randians. And I would like to suggest that this is not a good way of selling libertarianism. Okay, let me tell you about my political philosophy that's, rejected by 95% of the world. And I'm going to convince you of this by saying that it depends upon a moral theory that's rejected by 99% of the world. Like, that's a great strategy. But anyway, I would like to suggest, no, libertarianism has nothing to do with egoism or selfishness. I think those are just completely different. Okay, so, what motivates libertarianism, according to me, is skepticism of authority. That is, libertarians are just people who don't understand why the state should be exempt from the moral principles that apply to everyone else. We don't have like a radically different moral view from everyone else. We just, we don't disagree about interpersonal ethics because the stuff that we don't want the state to do is stuff that nobody wants anyone other than the state to do. The difference is just that libertarians apply the same moral standards to the state that they apply to other agents. Right. So like you could, go to the most left-wing person, they will not think that I can go out and start taxing people. And whether left wing or right wing, they won't think that I get to do that. Okay, and so and why do I not get to tax people? It doesn't have anything to do with selfishness or altruism, right? It's just like, well, they have rights. It's just their money. I just can't do that, right? The reason why I don't think that I'm allowed to go out and take other people's money is not that I'm selfish. I think if I was selfish, maybe I would think that I get to take everybody's money.
Right.
Like, I don't think that I think nobody gets to take my money, but I also think I don't get to take theirs. So there's nothing like that's more selfish, more self-oriented than other-oriented about that. It's just the same rules for everyone.
Okay, good. Now my last question is a more like of an advice question. Philosophy is awesome, but also very difficult. And what advice would you give to philosophy students? Here in Brazil, it seems many are afraid to do original philosophy and think they can only be commentators. Like to be an original thinker, you have to be someone like Descartes or Nietzsche, and now we just comment these guys. Or
Yeah.
what do you have to say for philosophy students on this?
Well, yeah. I don't find commentary on the historical figures to be very interesting. So, like, what people do in history of philosophy is mostly they argue about what a historical figure meant by something. And I don't see why that matters at all. So, right. So, like, okay, so suppose that there's a debate about what this passage in Aristotle meant. And now suppose that at the end of inquiry, we figure out Aristotle meant P rather than Q. Some people thought he meant Q, but no, we figured out he meant P. So what? That doesn't matter. So, okay, now, can you do original philosophy? Well, I mean, like, the truth is most people are not going to do original philosophy that's good, but that doesn't mean that you should just sit there and comment on other people. You should, like, because that's not what matters. Like, what matters is what's the philosophical truth. So you should comment on what you think is true.
Right.
Tell the truth. Okay, so like you confront a philosophical problem, you try to say what you think is correct. What's the correct answer to that problem? And then if it turns out that what you think is correct is what somebody else also thought was correct, so what? You say it anyway, right? Like, you don't have to not say it because somebody else had that view too, right? Um, and then, okay, unfortunately, in the journals, it's hard to get published if you're saying something that's too similar to what somebody else has said before. And I think this is kind of like an error on the part of the journals, because I think so, like, you can understand this because they're thinking, well, like, what's the point in publishing something that's really similar to what somebody else has said? Because people could already read the first article that says that. But the problem with this as a rule for deciding on what gets published is um, it makes the literature as a whole more boring.
Yeah.
So we have a bunch of articles that, like, the way you have to get published is, or well, it's either more boring or irrational. Okay, because the way to get published is either to find some way of saying something that's so outlandish that nobody has said it before. And like, and with philosophy having gone on for 2000 years, if somebody's never said something before, like, it might be that it's totally like, it's totally crazy and wrong. Okay, so then you have people taking crazy positions like David Lewis's modal realism or something. And then okay, and then the other way of getting published is, well, you have to take something that is so specific and so narrowly focused on the exact course of the literature over the last 10 years that it couldn't have been said before now. Okay, but that leads to just super boring articles that are like nitpicking on tiny aspects of, whatever, this person's response to this other person's objection to this argument. Um, so yeah. But anyway, like, I don't, it as like a piece of professional advice. Oh, well, I guess you have to sort of like play the game. So you have to like try to, you have to make the small modifications to somebody's theory if you want to get published. But sort of like, just for your own thinking about philosophy, I think people should be thinking about the big questions, and they shouldn't be thinking about whether it's original or not, because that's irrelevant.
Okay.
All that matters for belief formation is what's the truth.
Yeah, great. This remembers the beginning of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, where he says something like this: "I don't really care if someone wrote this before me. I'm just gonna do it anyway, and please don't bother me about this." And
Yeah.
I found this very, very, very good, because there's this great fear of, am I in date with the literatures? Am I not reading someone, and that I should be reading? Anyway, Dr. Huemer, thank you very much for your kind presence here on my podcast. I know these were a lot of questions, and I will send you the link when it's up on the channel. Thank you so much.
Yep. Oh, thanks for having me. It's been great talking to you.